everybody, this is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series between writers. Thank you all for listening over the past couple of years. I am having a good time. I am enjoying myself, and I am meeting a ton of interesting and creative and brilliant writers. So it's kind of, except for the fact of how much money I spend on this thing, it's pretty much an all-win situation for me, and hopefully for you as well. A real quick note before we dig into today's podcast, just a reminder that I am offering one-on-one writing coaching now. So if you are an aspiring writer, if you're an established writer, if you're a struggling writer, I help writers with all phases of their careers, teaching from anything from the actual craft in terms of how I write to, helping you discover your why as a writer, which sounds like a really flighty thing to say, but it is. Understanding why you write or why you want to write is the most critical thing that you have to answer before embarking on a writing journey or a writing career, because it will inform every decision that you make. And it probably took me a few years to figure out my why as a writer. And the simple answer is I can't picture myself not doing it. You need to know that why in order to navigate the publishing industry. So if you are interested in a free consultation about potentially working with me for coaching, just email me at carterwilson.com or go to my website, carterwilson.com, and you can read more about what I offer on there. All right, on to the show today. So today I had a fascinating guest. I really enjoyed this conversation. I had not met her or spoken with her before. Today, I talked to Hailey Piper. So Hailey is the Bram Stoker Award-winning author of Queen of Teeth, Light Most Hateful, The Worm and His King series, and other books of dark fiction. So yeah, she writes dark stuff, as do I. She's probably darker than I am. But it's all shades, right? And we talked a little bit in our conversation today, because I hate that question from interviewers is like, why do you write dark stuff? Because it just feels like a lazy question. But of course I kind of went that direction with Hailey, and we had a conversation about being asked those things, by interviewers, and the idea of what you write is a direct reflection of who you are. Which, I reject that premise altogether. You can have had a totally normal childhood and write some of the darkest shit that's out there. We got into that a little bit. But she, we talked a lot of shop in this conversation. It was fantastic. And everything from editing to AI. So it was pretty interesting. And her newest book, which just came out a few months ago, is Cruel Angels Past Sundown, and it looks amazing. So I highly encourage you to check that out. This is a fantastic conversation, so good it even went a little long and well worth it. So I hope you enjoy. This is my conversation with Hailey Piper.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. You look apprehensive.
I'm confused because I've never seen Zoom say AI companion at the bottom before.
Oh, I don't know what that is. That's a whole new feature. I don't know what happens if I click on it, but I'm not planning to click on it.
Yeah. Okay.
I stay away from anything that says AI on it.
Right.
as much as possible. Yeah. I'm a real person. These are real questions.
Oh no, I know that it doesn't have the capability that people think it has to pretend that kind of stuff.
No, I know, and it's fascinating. I mean, it's scary, obviously, and it's fascinating as a writer to kind of follow it. Just even seeing where it's being, like, there was just an article like Sports Illustrated, for example, just started. They had some articles that were, not only were the articles AI generated, but they were fake and AI generated bios and images of the reporter. So, it
was garbage. Like, the actual text doesn't say anything. It's just
complete garbage. Yeah. But it is worrisome. And in the more conferences I go to this year, that is the hot topic, right? And nobody knows. Nobody,
Well, because they think Skynet, they think, Johnny Five, and it's really just the bit of your phone that changes fuck to duck. That's what that is.
right.
And that's
right.
what you want to place all the trust in every company in the world on, and every system we use.
Totally. Totally. I know, and as a novelist, all you could do is, embrace what you do and the joy of doing it and the writing, and not, go down that rabbit hole, because that's easy to go down, that fear of like, they're going to replicate my books. There's going to be.
I'm not worried about being replaced as far as the art is concerned. It's more about the product.
Yeah.
That is the situation. But again, it's never going to be where they tell investors and stockholders it's going to be.
Right.
The best they can do, because even what's being generated now goes through about, like, what they say, 10,000 people who are not being compensated for all the labor they're doing. It is essentially to prop up this hollow shell, get as many people to invest in it as possible, and then, hit the road right before it all collapses.
Like crypto.
It's exactly like that. So I'm sure in a year or two, this is going to fall apart, and there's going to be some new scam that, again, presented to shareholders. They're going to get all excited about it. It's like, new thing, shiny new thing. And it's junk. It's just junk.
Yeah. And meanwhile, I mean, one of the real problems is there's, and probably will continue, is AI generated novels that are just, available. And
Right. It's just there to soak up like the Kindle Unlimited funds, which just siphons it away from real authors who are
exactly. I mean, that is, it's a little bit, and I mean, I'm probably going to get shit for this. It's a little bit akin to just anybody self-publishing. And I don't really have any problem with self-publishing, but I think there are a lot of people who just throw their book out there without really thinking about it. And then you're flooding, you're flooding the marketplace, and it does make it harder for authors to get found.
Even that still has more merit in this. It's just
100%.
It's just pouring several dictionaries into a blender, stewing it up, and then slapping on there. Even somebody who just, thoughtlessly just uploads their book to Amazon is still actually doing something.
They still wrote the book.
Right. They still put the effort in. They still cared about it, et cetera. Maybe they don't have a great business plan, but nonetheless, it still was something they did, which is more than you can say for any of this predictive text slop.
Totally. So you're in.
We just jumped into talking about stuff.
No, that's.
I got concerned because my grocery app now has an AI thing. I'm like, what the hell are you going to do for me?
Oh, that's interesting.
It's just weird. It's just getting shoved into everything. So I just that was just the first thing. Yeah.
And it's being branded into everything. Like
right.
That's like,
because now that they've invested in it, they need to sell it. They need to make money off of it.
Right. But to me, it's like, I'm turned off when you tell me it's powered by AI. That's not a marketing plus for me.
Right. Totally same.
Yeah. So you're in Maryland, right?
Yes.
Don't worry. I don't really have any real questions. This is all a free.
No, it's fine. I'm just like, okay, that's how the podcast will start.
Oh yeah. This podcast goes all over the place. Are you from that area? Parts of Maryland are beautiful.
Oh yeah, Maryland's gorgeous. It's a very weirdly shaped state as far as like, if you say you're from Maryland, it's like, okay, you could be from, that could mean like 5 very different things.
Right.
But no, I'm from New York originally.
Oh, where in New York?
You say upstate, that means a different thing.
I went to school in upstate New York.
How south you are in New York. If you're in Manhattan, everything's upstate.
Right.
Like Catskills.
Okay. Yeah. I went to school up in the Finger Lakes region. So and my sister still lives there, even though
it's a bigger state than people realize. So there's a lot of, so that's like a whole different area.
Right. Totally. So I'm curious to know, before we get into kind of your books and your writing, I'm just curious to know, growing up, were you exhibiting creativity beyond what most kids have? Did you have it? I mean, I'm always fascinated by that. And if there is an inflection point, that inflection point where somebody's like, there's this light that turns on and they're like, I'm good at writing. I'm good at storytelling. For me, that didn't happen until I was 33. But some people I see, I remember when I was 12, I had a teacher, did you have a moment like that or aspirations to write?
That sounds nice. Not really. There wasn't, I mean, as far as I can remember, I was always like drawing or telling stories. And then once I, mastered the alphabet, then I was, probably 8, I think is when I started like trying to write stuff. It was very hit and miss though. Like I'd write something and then I'd write nothing for months or years later. And then I'd write another something and then, and more time would pass.
But did you? Go ahead.
I remember. I think maybe one point was I'd gotten a pretty terrible report card, and my mom really let me have it for that one. I don't know why that particular one. It probably was pretty bad. I just don't remember very well. But she was like, "What are you going to do with your life with grades like that?" And I said, "I don't know. I could be a writer."
Yep. Good career decision.
But later on, there was a point where it wasn't just something I was doing. It was something that I was like, I wanted to do. And that was after I finished Stephen King's It. I stayed up till 2 a.m. finishing it because it was I just couldn't stop once it started that, I think 200 to 300 page climax realm.
Right. It's a
So
long climax.
It is, and I was just swept away. I had no idea books could do what he was doing in that, because a lot of people hate the ending to that book. That's not me. I adore just the interweaving timeline of how they finally face Pennywise and everything, and just that was also my first experience with cosmic horror. And it was mind blowing. And when I finished the book, I was like, and I was pretty young still. I was a young teenager, but I was I want to make people feel the way this made me feel.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the point where it was a real decision, I think.
That's a pretty early age. I mean, so for me, that book was The Stand, which I probably read when I was 15. And, that was probably the first substantial novel that would otherwise look completely inaccessible to a 15-year-old. And you start reading, you're like, holy shit, this is like you said, you get pulled into this universe that, you just can't get enough of, despite it being 1,100 pages or whatever the average version is.
It's one of those things where it's just, when we're younger, we have more time in a lot of ways, and and we read faster for whatever reason. At least not everybody. Just generally, that's what I found talking to people. And for me, I didn't have much money, so it was just the bigger the book. We would be at one of the department stores, because I grew up in a small town, so we didn't have we didn't really have a bookstore. But they were at the department store, and they'd have a line of Stephen King books. And I would be looking through, finding the one with the thickest spine, because they were pretty much all the same price, regardless of how big they were. So I would just pick out the biggest one and be like, this'll because if it was a normal book back then, 300 or 400 pages, it was only going to last me a week.
Right.
But a thick one like that, it's this can last me 3 weeks.
That's funny. I had the exact same experience in my 20s. In my 20s is when I kind of got really into reading. And I was living on my own in San Francisco, and same thing, used bookstores. That's how I got into James Clavell, because when you get into Shogun and King Rat and all those books that are all at minimum 800 pages, same thing, bang for your buck. And all of a sudden you're like, I don't want this book to end.
Right.
But it's, and then you realize, and I think when you're younger, to your point, your mind's emptier too. So you are more, I think, receptive to new things. And I think for me, as I get older, it's harder and harder to find that book that I read that I'm swept away. And maybe it's just being a writer, it's harder to appreciate other writing, and you stop being so academic when you're reading, as opposed to just letting the story take you. I don't know if you have that same issue or not.
Not really. I honestly have a hard time, like when it gets towards the end of the year, and people like, what were your favorite books? I have a hard time picking them out because I just find a lot that I end up loving.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's less an issue of I'm a writer, so it's hard. I actually like I want to learn from other writers too. So I'm very receptive when I'm reading. So when something hits me, not at that moment because I want to continue with the story, but later on, I'll go back to that. Like, okay, how did they do that to me? I want to understand it.
Right. And sometimes you can understand it if the writing's that good.
Yeah.
Cormac McCarthy's like that. I tried to deconstruct it. I'm like, I don't know why I love this. I shouldn't love this, but I love it.
It's the same with me with Ursula K. Le Guin. I don't know how she did what she did with, like, it's such complex emotions from such simple language and situations at times. And it's just like, I'm never going to be that good, but I'm going to keep trying.
Right. Right. Totally.
But no, it's just, it's really just an issue of time, like lack of time. I would read many more books each year if I had more time. Cause I really do. I do get swept away by a lot of them. It's just a matter of, I just don't have as much time as I did when I was younger. So because of that, now it's like, it's kind of rare for me to read a book that's over 600 pages, because that's just a big commitment. Like I've had Prior the Orange Tree for a couple years now, and I'm just like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to love this. It's like 1,200 pages or something. And or the audiobook is like 27 hours. And I'm just like, or 35 hours. I can't remember, but I'm just like, I'm not ready yet. I'll get there. But because once I start, I can't stop. It's a fantasy book, so I'm going to forget all the names if I stop. So I have to. When I start, it's like I can't read anything else right now. I need to focus on this.
It's crazy, and it's not even just books, right? It's like we are so bombarded with things that our eyes can be placed upon that everything feels like a challenge. So it could be a 3.5 hour movie that is going to be amazing, the new Scorsese movie or whatever.
Right.
Like 3.5 hours.
The hard part with that is that there's a lot of movies that are like 2 hours and 20 minutes long that should not be 2 hours and 20 minutes long. I'm thinking like a lot of action superhero kinds of movies. I'm like, this should be 90 minutes. Like, come on, guys, what are we doing here? But you are right. There is stuff where I'm like, I avoided watching Zodiac for years because I knew it was over 3 hours. But finally one night, my wife and I just were like, let's just watch it. And it went by like that. Like the pacing is so quick in that movie. It did not feel like a 3 hour movie. No. I'm like, I wish we'd watched that earlier. That was so good. And like, there's part of me, it's like, I could go for watching that again, but at the same time, also like, it's still a 3 hour block.
Right.
So,
right. But I mean, at least you can break it over a couple nights now with streaming.
I don't like doing that. I have to.
You're a purist.
I have to finish in one sitting. I can't do that. We just rewatched Lord of the Rings: Return of the King this past weekend, and we were like, we need to start in the mid-afternoon.
Yeah, that's commitment.
Right. It's the extended edition, so it's like this is like over 4 hours. So it's just like just gonna have to get all the chores done, whatever else done. We're gonna sit and watch this. We did. Yeah. We got everything done.
Yeah. And then that same mentality, though, for me at least, it bleeds in sometimes when I'm writing and try, as much as I tell myself I'm writing for myself and maybe people will like it, who knows, but this is where I find the joy. It does bleed in a little bit of like, okay, am I being too introspective here? Is this taking too long? Is my agent's voice in my head saying something needs to happen soon because people are going to you're going to lose people's attention. I don't know if you have that same sense, but every year that goes by, I feel like you have to grab them sooner and sooner. And that's however you grab them. And that doesn't have to be action. It could just be intrigue. But I feel like there's that constant pressure. People like, I did not finish because nothing happened in the first 10 pages.
I don't know. I tend to think of that as a that's a second draft problem to me.
Yeah.
I don't really,
Totally.
I don't really think about, what other people are going to think of stuff while I'm doing the first draft, because the first draft really is completely for me to be indulgent, to be messy, whatever. Like I was writing something and I looked back and I was like, there's 23 pages of exposition here and conversation for relating to that. And I was like, okay, well, that can't be there later, but I need to keep moving for now. So just make a note and just move on, because I needed to get that out, because I needed to know those things. I needed to get those straight, but I can acknowledge in hindsight that the reader doesn't need to know all that stuff. And they certainly don't need it in a chunk like that.
Right.
Um,
And sometimes you lose perspective yourself. Like you might not even identify that in the second or third draft, and it takes your editor to tell you. For me, at least, sometimes I'm like, this is as good as it can be from my perspective. I need more eyes on this at this point.
And some books are like that. Sometimes I know exactly what I'm doing here. I know every part of this. I know exactly how I want to present it. And then it'll either be the editor agrees and there's not as much to do, or doesn't agree and shows me things that I wasn't aware of. But sometimes it is like that, where I'm like, I can't make this better by myself. And I need help. I need my editor to see it. I need some perspective. And sometimes then it is, okay, well, here's what you could do here, 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 and here. That's going to make it stronger. I'm like, okay, I'll write that. And then sometimes it's like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. This works. So it's like, you're never right and you're never wrong.
Right. But, and we talk about this a lot on the podcast, is that, that initial editorial letter, and I've been with my editor now for the past 6 books. So we have, we don't talk a lot, but we have a good relationship and we know each other. And I find like she doesn't tend to say, do this or do that. She'll say, this is how I felt reading this part. And kind of leaves it up to me to interpret that. She might give me some advice, but being very cautious about not telling the writer what to do. And other editors are like, yeah, I think you need to make this person X, Y, or Z. Where does your editor fall? What do you prefer in that kind of conversation?
It's a difficult question because I have a bunch of different editors. How many presses are my books with? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, so 7. And then I think I'll be repeating with 3 next year, but there's one book I'll be with a new one. So it'll be one more than whatever number I just said. But so that's all different editors for different publishers or presses. So some of them are very much like, we want to, feel how you're feeling about this. Like, there's some suggestions, here's some thoughts. Others are just like, I think this is what needs to be done with this. Like, this character needs more this or whatever. We need to see more of that. This part, this happened too easily, etc.
Right.
Right. I mean, heck, with Queen of Teeth, what was funny with that book was when I was writing it, and I went through many drafts very quickly because I just kept changing what I wanted to do with certain parts. But for me, the first third of the book was rock solid, and it was the second 2/3 that I kept changing a bunch. And then when edits came back, developmental edits came back from the publisher, they were like, the last 2/3 are gold. The first third, we need to like kind of merge some scenes, like maybe remove a couple scenes, move some stuff around.
Right.
Which we did do, and it did make the book better. It was just kind of funny because you never know.
You never know, but usually they're right. My sense is like, if you have a good relationship with them and you trust them, you can look at these comments and be like, God damn it, you're right. I mean, and
sorry.
Go ahead.
I think there's a misconception sometimes with writers when an editor asks a question and they kind of misinterpret it as like, why does this need to be here? But that's not really what's happening. They just want to make sure that you have an answer to it, that you know why you're doing what you're doing, that it's on purpose.
Right.
And sometimes there's stuff that you kind of have to pick your battles. Because I think if you do have a good rapport and you trust the editor and the editor trusts you, then you do find a kind of equilibrium. There's some stuff though where I'm just like, the editor has an issue with this paragraph, and like, they've had an issue with like 10 different paragraphs, and I've done something with those 10 other paragraphs, but this paragraph, I'm like, no,
Right.
I'm right here. This is necessary. Now maybe it needs to change. Maybe something needs to be developed more with it. There was one in Light Most Hateful where it was late in the book, and there were two editors on that. And they both felt that there was something a little, something, I don't know if it was discomforting. It's been a little while since you went through editing that one.
Yeah.
So I can't remember exactly what it was, but I ended up making the paragraph bigger. I was like, I'm just going to further explore this idea to the point that it doesn't feel like it's out of left field, that it feels that, because it was a microcosm of the theme of the book to me. And they couldn't quite see that. So I was like, all right, I'll expand on this and explore it further because it is so important. So I'll make it feel like it blends better with the stuff around it, but we're not getting rid of it. It's just too important.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I think a lot of maybe, first time debut authors, for example, don't really know that like you don't have to accept all those comments.
Right.
I mean, although I preach all the time that, you're not just done when you're done writing. You're a team player. You are part of the publication team.
Right.
And so
that's the other thing. Like I've had I've had over 100 short stories published. That's a lot of editors, a lot of different editors.
Yeah.
And I tend to learn something from each of them that makes me just a little bit better of a writer each time.
Right.
Working with editors makes you better. And the thing is, again, like you said, when you work with someone multiple times, you do kind of reach this equilibrium because you'll kind of stop doing some of the things that were problems earlier on because you learn, you become a smoother writer, or you become better at communicating ideas or whatever it is. It's just there's a development to it. So it is, it is collaborative in a lot of ways that, earlier writers may not be aware of, both in the sense of listening to the editor, but also kind of like have those discussions. That's sometimes what the book needs is for the two of you to have a conversation about this, that, or the other thing, as opposed to just bouncing back and forth with stat or whatever.
Yeah, totally. And then when you have that conversation, it is a lot more enlightening. But I think the other thing is, so your example of 100 short stories and all those editors, you also have to develop a maturity that only comes with time to know what to listen to. And it's like in a critique group, right? Not everybody when you first started a critique group, you listen to everybody, and then your story becomes way worse because you're taking everybody's advice. And I think that's a really hard thing to develop over time. And it's just instinct, right?
It is. That's exactly the word I was going to say. It's a matter of developing an instinct, because there are first time editors as well. And they sometimes make mistakes too, or I forget what editor said it to me, but was saying if you see them kind of nitpicking at a lot of little things and throughout, that's usually kind of an inexperienced thing. And I actually
copy editing, yeah,
right. Well, it's not even that, but it's like it's trying to adjust your style to a style that they like, and it's like, no, that doesn't work. If they accepted a story that's in your style, now obviously that doesn't mean everything you did was right or best, but there has to be a balance there. And I've had stories, I forget, this was years ago. I'd written an adult story, and the editors were kind of trying to change it to a YA story. And
that's a major edit, by the way.
Right. And I ended up rejecting a lot of those edits because I was like, no, this is changing the tone of the story. This is changing what kind of story it is. And I wouldn't know until years later when an editor had told me that I was like, oh, this is probably because this was such a new thing for those editors. Just as I'm a stronger writer now than I was then, they're probably stronger editors at this point.
Yeah, right, totally. And I'm curious, one of the reasons I started this podcast not only was to talk to writers, but to not ask the questions that I hate being asked. Where did
you get your ideas?
Which unfortunately I'm going to do to you, because one of the, I write pretty dark psychological thrillers. And so I get the question, why so dark? What happened in your childhood? And, it kind of drives me nuts, because I'm like, well, why can't I be allowed to have an imagination?
Right.
My mother thinks you write what you know, in which case I'd be a fucking psychopath. But I'm like, I like conflict, and I think it's interesting, and I like these kinds of stories when I was a kid, because I wanted to imagine what I would do in this situation. And for me, it's a way of safely exploring dark themes. And maybe there's some kind of therapy in that. I don't know. But do you get that question a lot when you tend to write, when somebody writes horror? I would only imagine you get the question of like, well, why horror? Why don't you write romance, or bullshit questions like that?
Yes. And I'm glad you said that exact example, because that is something as a woman that you get asked quite a bit.
Oh, it's interesting.
Children's books, why don't you write romance?
Oh, interesting.
And it's like, well, I did write a romance book. It was also a horror book, and
Right.
and it won an award. So, I had it both ways.
That's fantastic.
But yeah,
yeah, it gets old, right? Like
it does get old, because it's just, why would you assume that I wouldn't want to? Why would you assume that anyone would want to? But it is a question. Just I don't know, maybe because I'm like, I talk to other women who write horror. We've all got that question more than once. I don't know if we get it more than the men do.
Yeah.
Possibly, but
Yeah.
if so, I don't hear them talking about it as much. But it's not like it doesn't happen though.
Yeah.
But there is kind of this assumption that like we should write nice things, and that also kind of the thing with romance. One of the rules of romance is happy ending. But the thing is, like, do you think that means that nothing bad happens in romance books? Like, lots of bad things happen in romance books.
Right. Because, without that conflict, the story is, to me, inherently uninteresting. Like, if everything's just going along, and same thing with quote unquote literary fiction. I can appreciate solid writing. But there's got to be stakes, and the stakes can be tiny to you, huge to the character, whatever.
Right.
There's got to be something to lose, some kind of sacrifice, and it doesn't have to be formulaic, but you need to feel it as a human reader. You need to have the empathy for like, oh, this is a tough situation, whatever that situation may be.
I mean, there's a great book that came out this year, Chlorine by Jade Song, and that's one of those things where I'm just like it's really solid book. I think it's the author's debut, and a lot of people would position as literary, and maybe it is, because it is very character focused, and a lot of it is going on. A lot of it's very internal, about this character who, through various events, feels that she needs to turn into a mermaid, or always was a mermaid, just trapped on land. But a lot of the things that are happening are very small, like from an outside point of view, but they're everything to her.
Right. And it's the ability to convey that weight to that one character. Can be really difficult to do.
Storytelling. That's in the wording. That's presentation and communication. It's not all just this is where I have a hard time understanding, because there are some writers, and you may be one of them, I don't know, who say like they write the movie in their head. They have a movie running in their head. That's the story, and they write that. And I'm like, I have a really hard time with that, because it's really difficult to convey that kind of internalized sense of scope by just thinking about what you could portray on a movie screen necessarily.
Right. If you read a movie script, it's such a weird experience, because
it is.
It's just dialogue and a few setting scene descriptions, and I'm a firm believer that the thing that has to bubble to the surface more than character and more than plot is emotion. You should always know how your character is feeling. And it doesn't have to be conveyed in this heavy-handed way.
Right.
But a person reading it should be like, wow, I know I'm in this person, which is why I tend to write first person present tense, because it lets me get there. But without the emotion, like you read emotionless books and you can have all the right elements of the world, but it's just flavorless to me.
Right.
Because you're not connecting to anything. You don't care what happens to anybody because nobody feels anything.
Right.
And that takes for me, it took a long time to develop, and I'm still learning.
That's voice. And that does
It
take
is.
time. That's why it's wild to me, and this will go on forever as long as writing is a thing, but people thinking there's some secret ingredient or some key that's like, this is how to write. And it's like, it's just work. You just do the work and you keep at it. And you
Right.
start to develop your own voice. You start out by copying a lot of people who you admire. And then it just kind of, you start to develop your own thing. And eventually you get better at it.
Right. And you take risks, I think,
Right,
and
exactly.
and maybe not like purposeful, like I want to do this because, maybe this will hit, because I'm a firm believer in you should always write for yourself. You should always write for the joy of writing and
Yeah.
everything else. And that's not to say you don't put the work in, but that's your first draft is the joy of writing.
Right.
But for me, I remember like I got sick of people who I knew telling me, oh, I totally see you in this character. I didn't like that. I don't want to be identified as a character. So I started writing from a female point of view, and it changed my world. That's how I found my voice, truly. And because I realized like being somebody that I'm not really is helpful. There was a freedom, almost a release of like, I'm not tied to, what I would do in this situation. But that wasn't really like why I did it. I just was sick of people telling me I sounded like it. So, but that just takes time to develop it. And who knows, how that's going to come about eventually. Have
Right.
you seen yourself change a lot as a writer over the years?
I mean, you won't notice it's happening.
Right.
It's one of those hindsight things. You're like,
Mhm.
oh, this is very different than what I used to write, or it sounds very different than what I used to write. Um, yes. I mean, because again, it takes a lot of time to get that far. But oh, I guess, do you mean since I was little and writing stuff?
Well, I hope
I
you've
mean,
kind
that
of
would
changed
have to
since
happen.
then. But I mean, it's just interesting as more and more books comes out that you publish. Like for example, I don't ever go back and read any of my shit unless I'm doing a reading and I have to find a passage or whatever.
Yeah.
But when I go back and look at some of my early stuff, that's the stuff I'm most afraid to even look at. Even though it was published. But then I look at it, I'm like, it's not so bad, but it's pretty different than what I'm writing now. I used to be a lot darker than I am now, but I'm still pretty dark. But I used to just really go for it back then. Like, yeah, that's just not there's nothing wrong with it, but that's just not how I feel right now.
Yeah. And you have to kind of go with that. And you have to go with what you feel is best to do at the time. I remember in the 90s, Hayao Miyazaki was trying to, he needed to pick a project at the time. And he had one where I think it was a bunch of bugs that were like living in a yard. And there was kind of like, and I don't know if this ever became a movie. It was that or Princess Mononoke. And which is like his darkest, like bloodiest movie, I would say. And someone told him, you should make the action movie because that is the kind of thing it gets harder to do certain things as you get older. Not necessarily action movies, but just certain kind of material you're going to click with more at different times of your life than others.
Yeah. That's totally true. And it's also true that what might trigger you as a reader, you're totally okay writing. Like I've written stuff that I don't know if I'd want to read that from somebody else. But it's just kind of came out of me, and then maybe I edit it and change it or whatever. But
Yeah.
and then that changes over time too. It's like, no, I'm not going to. Yeah, having kids, for example, all of a sudden you have a little bit of a different perspective.
Right.
I've written horrible things about kids while having kids. Don't get me wrong, but it does make you have a different perspective at least.
Yeah. And what was I going to say? Yeah, I have definitely looked at older stuff, like from just, earlier in publishing. I think the voice is pretty consistent. It is sometimes a matter of what I end up focusing on. And there are definitely things where I'll kind of stumble into and I'll notice them after, like when I'm doing second draft or revisions, whatever, then I'm like, all right, let's get that out of here. I know better. I knew not to do that now. These things that I'm not, wild about that are habits. Between books, I try to keep my voice consistent. Like I know what my voice is, so I kind of just lean into it and do it.
Yeah.
Short stories is where I get a little more experimental. Because I think all of my books so far are third person, present or third person past tense, but like close third. So you're stuck in the POV of whatever the main character of that scene is typically. But short stories, I'll go over the place. First person, past tense, present tense, second person, all kinds of, whatever. Because I just want to try all kinds of different things. So the short stories, it's,
right.
It's there and then it's done.
I have such respect for short story writing, and I've done maybe a dozen only. And I find it tremendously difficult to write a good short story. And I usually end up writing like a microcosm of a moment in somebody's life that I picture as a fully fledged novel. So do you have a preference to write in writing short stories versus novels? And in your short stories, are you usually writing, because you've been commissioned to write them, or are you just writing them and then seeing what's going to happen with them?
It used to be that I preferred short stories. At this point, I think I'm more into writing books.
Yeah.
And some people might say I'm cheating because I do tend to write novellas. Where it's like, oh, those are short books. And it's just like, well, yeah.
And they're books.
Still books. They're still books.
They're not short stories.
Nobody's going to take a 40,000 word short story.
Right.
As far as, and I think back then, and maybe there's a relation here, I don't know. Back when I was more into writing short stories, it was just writing them because I wanted to, send them out, seeing if anybody, wanted them to. These days, it is more commissioned. It's pretty rare that I'm writing one just off the cuff. For whatever reason, like kind of feels like a big deal when I'm just like, I just need to write this short story. Because it's so rare anymore. But usually it is somebody, invited to an anthology, or will you contribute to this, whatever project.
And there's something about that, and being invited to an anthology where you're committed to a theme, and it's kind of a fun challenge. It might be like everything has to happen in a bowling alley, and you're like, I could probably think of something messed up that happens in a bowling alley. How do I make it different than everybody else? And sometimes
that is the big thing and I was doing that back when I was submitting to anthology calls, just without being invited, was just like, what is everyone else going to think of first and second and third? Like, what are the most typical things for this theme?
Right.
Don't do those.
Right.
But I mean, part of that is also just like, I'm never starting with a blank page. Because like one of the important things I think is when you have a thought, an observation, a character, anything, write it down. Is it relevant to your current project? No, then write it down anyway. Just keep the notes, because you never know what's going to be useful later, and it teaches your brain to keep giving them to you.
Right.
Like John Langan, I think had a thing about a guy in an elevator going up to your brain to bring a message, essentially. And it's just like, you keep rejecting messages, eventually the guy's going to stop showing up.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
So when I get invited to a themed call, Typically I start glancing through those notes. It's a couple hundred pages of notes on my that I transcribe them on my computer, and I
Wow.
organize them a little bit so I'm not completely losing my mind when I try to do this.
Right.
But I'll look at those notes and see what like is clicking in my head between that theme and like any of these notes. And usually that's the file where the short story begins. I'll create a new heading, for whatever,
Yeah.
and I'll just start piling a few of those in there and see what start, like they're essentially each seeds, so see what starts to bloom. And then those stuff that doesn't get used, it just gets pushed back down into the notes again.
Right. And a lot of it will never
find
get
a place
used.
later. Right. It'll get there. I had
Right.
even for when I'm writing a book, sometimes I'll skim through those notes just to see if there's something that's applicable.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't write anything down. If I'm in the middle of a book, usually about 3/4 of the way through a book, something will happen and I'll start thinking about the next book. And it'll just be the smallest nugget of an idea, and I won't write it down because I'm like, if it's good, it'll stay. And then every day I think about it a little bit, maybe 30 seconds. And then it starts to grow. And then sometimes it just fizzles out. Like one day I wake up, I'm like, that's a stupid idea. But over time, you're like, I think I can do so. And because all I do is I write that first chapter and I don't know anything else. And I don't outline or anything. So I don't have to have the fully thing fledged out in my head. But yeah, I don't almost write anything down.
Yeah, I couldn't do that. I would just forget everything.
Yeah.
Sometimes sometimes a sentence of prose or a exchange of dialogue comes in so crystal clear that I have to write it down because I'm not gonna have the wording later if I just sit on it.
Yeah.
But also, like as far as I do outline, the outline is written less in stone, more in sand. But I do need kind of to get kind of an idea that there is a road, even if I'm going to completely diverge from that road
Right.
after a couple steps.
Right. Right. Especially if you want to run that idea by somebody, they need to know at least the guts of it.
That's so hard for me. I
know, me too.
Ideas because I'm just like, but what if I completely change what I wanted?
Right.
To
And
do
you
with
probably
it?
will
Right.
change it. Yeah, I know.
I mean,
I know sometimes the publisher wants a synopsis. I'm like, I don't know what happens past the first 3 chapters.
Right.
So you just have to trust me.
Or I know right now, but then I finish those 3 chapters
Yeah.
and it's like, oh, wait a sec. Actually, this other path is a much better idea.
Right.
To continue from there. The one I'm working on right now, I had a very vague outline. I wrote the first couple chapters, realized the outline wasn't going to work for that, got rid of the first chapter and made the second chapter the first chapter.
Yeah, totally.
Continued by a couple more chapters, completely changed the outline, wrote a couple more chapters, decided that the second half of the outline was a mess and just kind of pushed that down the file a little bit. It was like, and then rearranged everything in the first half. And then I was like, I don't know, I'm just going to get to that point. And so I did. And then it was just like, I'll have to figure out the outline for the rest is.
Right.
But that's okay because it's a developing organism.
Right.
As
100%.
As opposed to just like carving something into rock. It's like, no, it's growing. It's developing. It's changing. It's becoming more mature. It's understanding what it is. I'm understanding what it is. And even though like I'm at that point, I just did an outline for the rest of the book. For all I know, I'll get to 3/4 and just be like, no, the rest of this needs to change again. Now, I don't think so right now. I'm pretty confident, but how am I going to feel in 2 weeks?
Yeah.
So
It's weird. It's the physical act of writing and forcing yourself, because you have to be so fully present in the moment to write, that it just opens your mind to other ideas. And that's why I've never been able to outline, because I will almost immediately diverge from it because I'll just think of something that is more interesting to me. And I'm like, I don't know if I could have just sat there outlining and figured out these interesting elements. I have to be in the journey itself, but everyone's different.
Well, and that's the thing. Like some of those outline bits are those impulses,
100%.
because like I had this so difficult because I had 5 different possibilities, and I wrote them as like possibility and then just like kind of a word or two that said what they were. It's like, cool, I have 5 different directions I can go in at this point. They all sound interesting to me, but like you have to figure out what's best.
Right.
And it's one of those things also, like you're saying, while you're writing, getting ideas is something that's hard to teach, because you do have to assume that you're going to have observations and thoughts about the circumstances while you're writing. And there'll just be this little quirk in a paragraph that is like, that unlocks some completely new avenue you hadn't thought of. It was just a thing you put in on impulse, like why this character has this kind of hat. And then now you know later why that character has that hat. And it completely changes the story that you thought you were going to write.
Right. Which is, and I teach as well. And that's one of the things I will never, ever, ever teach is say, this is how you write a book, because it's so personal, but you can teach how to let yourself be in the moment, be vulnerable, and make sure you're carving out time to do it. And then those things, you will find that. But and those books drive me nuts. So it's like, here's the way you write a book. I'm like, no, that's the way you write a book.
That's here's how you give me $15 for telling you some possible things that may or may not work.
It takes all the joy out of it.
I don't teach, and the reason is because I'm kind of afraid of that exact thing, that I don't want someone to get the wrong idea that I'm telling them this is how you do it, because there is no such thing.
Yeah, that's actually the first thing that I say when I teach. I make that very clear, and I think that's a relief. Because people are like, that's why you love writing, is because it's so personal and so individual. Right. Well, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do very quick storytelling. This is the fun part of the show. I've selected 3 books quasi at random off my bookshelf. You're going to pick one of those books, and we're going to pick a random sentence from a random page. I'm going to read that sentence. And then that's just the first sentence in like maybe a 2-minute long short story. We'll just go back and forth, generating sentences. So this is the anti-AI. This is us actually doing it. Speaking of, I've got Stephen King's Just After Sunset collection of short stories. Emily Littlejohn's mystery, A Season to Lie, and a book of Victorian ghost stories.
Let's do that one.
Okay, so so this is going to be old English. Pick a number.
I can't promise that I'll end up.
We can do whatever we want.
I'll do old English.
So give me a number between 1 and 500.
Oh boy, 422.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly scan this and find a sentence. And the problem is with these Victorian ghost stories that all the sentences are like a paragraph long usually.
Right. Okay. Maybe I shouldn't pick that one.
All right. This is actually 2 sentences, but I'm going to read it. And I think we can work with this.
Okay.
What can I say, or how to describe it? A dead thing it was.
I hate the first thing that pops in my head is something sarcastic.
I'm good with sarcasm. Whatever you want to do. She's looking at her.
Read it again. I'm sorry. Read it one more time. Like,
I don't know what it was or how to. I don't know what it was or how to describe it. A dead thing it was. And I can go first if you want.
I first discovered it noticing the blood on my shoes.
I wasn't expecting to find anything like this all the way out in the sticks. All I wanted was a morning walk with my coffee. And now the police were going to have to be involved.
I'm so terrible.
No.
Like, what else can you expect from a Monday?
I reached down and touched its hand. I can only label it an it in my mind because there was no face. There was barely even a hand. But I knew this used to be somebody, maybe somebody from around here. I was surprised how well my stomach was able to handle it. Surprised enough that I actually went into the pockets of the pants to see what I could find.
You're good at doing this on improv. The guilt should have overwhelmed me, but after everything that's happened these past 3 months, I was delighted to find a gold pocket watch and a wallet filled with several hundred $100 bills.
How many times have I played this exact same scenario in my head over the years? The fantasy of finding money combined with the horror of being framed for murder. Now here it was. And for all the programs I've watched, for all the episodes of CSI I devoured, my fingerprints were now stupidly all over this corpse.
There's no going back from here. I can either can walk away, replace, go through it with gloves, replace the wallet with another. I could tell the truth, but after everything that's happened, that's not going to work. Or I could get to the shack, get to the shed and get out a shovel, and get to work.
I think we call it there. That's exactly where I was going to go. Like, I love the idea that you're totally innocent, but you go to this extreme because you have this minuscule concern that you're going to be framed for this. So you actually, almost convict yourself by burying this body that you had nothing to do with.
And my assumption, like if I were just to have read this, that my assumption would be that this character is in some dire enough straits that they would, financially perhaps, that they would be going through the pockets just to see if there was something. Right. And before they thought, hey, I'm implicating myself.
Yeah, totally. It's like a Simple Plan, the movie Simple Plan, where they find all the money, but then there's bodies involved and they just wanted the money. Well, listen, that was a fantastic. I was so pleased to be able to meet you and talk shop with you.
Great.
It's a little bit of a different podcast where we just kind of this little inside baseball, but I always enjoy and I always learn from the other writers I talk to. So I appreciate your time and what a pleasure to meet you.
This is wonderful. Thank you for having me on.
All right. And congratulations with your recent release.
Oh, thank you.
Take care, Hailey.
You too. Bye.
So that's it. That is my conversation with Hailey Piper. She said she was worried about doing the storytelling, but I thought we did a good job. I thought that had a lot of potential, that story. So I'm eager to see where it goes, and I like the idea of somebody just burying a body that they had nothing to do with. I think there's a lot of good plot elements that can be derived from that. So I encourage you to go check out her website, HaileyPiper.com. You can check out all of her books. You can read her news about her stuff being optioned for TV and film, which is so awesome. And you can read all about her. So please go to her website. And while you're on the internet, please go to my website, CarterWilson.com. You can check out my books, check out my events, and there's links in there about my retreats and coaching as well. So check that out and reach out to me. I always like to hear from people. So if you have a question or a recommended guest for the podcast or just feedback, I am all ears. So please reach out. That is it for now. More episodes of Making It Out very soon, likely next week. In the meantime, as always, I appreciate you either watching this or listening on your device. Take care.